The world remembers him with the moniker Brother of the Warmonger, and as the Grand Admiral of the German Empire, who drove humanity into the slaughterhouse. In the cold eyes of the victorious nations, he was merely one of the demons responsible for the horrific tragedy of the First World War. The uniform he wore became a symbol of arrogance and destruction, and his name was shoved into the dark corners of history books, relegated to a list of losers deserving of condemnation. But after the court of history closed its doors and the noise faded, it was not the madness of the empire that stood guard over his humble grave, but the earnest tears of his sailors. He was a figure of noble sacrifice, a man who begged an enemy king to spare his brother's life, and the only captain who stood alone at the helm of a sinking ship while all others fled. He was Prince Heinrich of Prussia, the perfectly normal hero eclipsed by the shadow of the mad Kaiser Wilhelm II. Why did the sanest man, clad in the uniform of the maddest era, remain silent to the very end? The year was 1862. The Kingdom of Prussia was a rising power, vibrating with the tension between old feudalism and new industrial might. In the Neue Palais in Potsdam, a sprawling Baroque palace that felt more like a museum than a home, a child was born on August 14th. They named him Albert Wilhelm Heinrich. He was the third child and second son of Crown Prince Frederick William, known as Fritz, and his wife Victoria, the Princess Royal of Great Britain. The birth was smooth, the baby was healthy, and he cried with a vigor that pleased the wet nurses. In any other family, this would be a joyous yet ordinary event. But in the Hohenzollern family, Heinrich's health was an immediate, silent accusation against his older brother. 3 years earlier, his brother Wilhelm had been born after a traumatic breech birth that left his left arm permanently withered and paralyzed. In the hyper-masculine militaristic culture of Prussia, a physical deformity in the heir to the throne was not just a medical issue, it was a dynastic catastrophe. It was viewed as a divine flaw, a weakness that had to be hidden or compensated for with extreme aggression. From the moment Heinrich drew his first breath, he was the healthy one, the spare, who possessed the physical perfection that the heir lacked. This dynamic poisoned the relationship between the brothers before Heinrich could even speak. Wilhelm, intelligent but emotionally unstable, grew up resenting Heinrich's easy athleticism. Heinrich, in turn, grew up learning that his very existence was a source of insecurity for the future Kaiser. The atmosphere in the royal nursery was suffocating. Their mother, Vicky, was a brilliant but difficult woman. She was the daughter of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, and she was a fierce liberal who believed that Prussia needed to be saved from its own backward, militaristic traditions. She hated the Prussianism of the court, the obsession with uniforms, the rigidity, the arrogance. She wanted her sons to be English gentlemen, enlightened, constitutional, and civilized. However, her method of achieving this was draconian. She was obsessed with fixing Wilhelm's arm, subjecting the boy to electric shocks and cruel stretching machines. When those failed, she turned her critical gaze on their characters. Heinrich grew up watching his older brother being tortured in the name of medical treatment, a witness to the primal trauma that would warp the 20th century. While Wilhelm reacted by becoming erratic, bombastic, and desperate for approval, Heinrich reacted by becoming invisible. He learned early on that the safest place to be was in the background. He developed a protective shell of modesty. He was not as intellectually dazzling as Wilhelm, who could be charming and witty when he wasn't flying into a rage, but Heinrich possessed something far more valuable: stability. Their education was entrusted to a Calvinist tutor named Georg Hinzpeter, a man who believed that the soul was forged through suffering. The boys were woken at dawn. They were forced to ride horses, a terrifying ordeal for the balanced, impaired Wilhelm, but effortless for Heinrich. They were drilled in history, languages, and religion for 12 hours a day without praise or affection. Hinz-Peter later admitted that he never once praised the crown prince. Heinrich, being the younger brother, was often collateral damage in this regime. He was less academic than Wilhelm, struggling with abstract concepts which earned him the scorn of his intellectual mother. Vicky wrote to her mother, Queen Victoria, that Heinrich was hopelessly behind and sluggish. She failed to see that what she called sluggishness was actually a deep, contemplative calmness. Heinrich did not feel the need to perform. He did not need to shout to be heard. As they entered adolescence, the divergence became a chasm. Wilhelm, desperate to escape his mother's criticism, threw himself into the arms of the Prussian military aristocracy. He began to worship the ethos of the Junker, the stiff-necked, conservative officer class that despised everything English. He loved the parades, the shiny buttons, the absolute obedience. He constructed a persona of the Iron Prince to hide his withered arm. Heinrich, however, found no comfort in the parade ground, the rigid, artificial world of the Potsdam Guard, where men were treated like automatons, held no romance for him. He was a practical boy. He liked to work with his hands. He was fascinated by how things worked: mechanics, engines, physics. The parade ground was theater. Heinrich wanted reality. In 1877, at the age of 15, Heinrich made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He asked to join the Imperial Navy. To modern ears, this sounds like a standard career choice for a prince. But in Prussia in 1877, this was almost an eccentric act. The Prussian army was the heart of the state. It had unified Germany, defeated Austria, and crushed France. The army was glorious. The Navy, by comparison, was a joke. It was a collection of coastal defense ironclads and obsolete sailing ships, looked down upon by the army generals as a haven for technicians and bourgeois engineers. It had no tradition, no social prestige, and no glory. For Wilhelm, the Navy would later become a tool of vanity, a way to compete with his grandmother's British Empire. But for 15-year-old Heinrich, the Navy was an escape. It was a way to get away from the suffocating court in Berlin, away from the hysterical demands of his mother, and away from the bullying arrogance of his brother. The sea offered a horizon that Potsdam could not. It offered a meritocracy where the ocean didn't care who your grandfather was. If you couldn't knot a line or read a sextant, you were useless, prince or not. His parents agreed, perhaps thinking that the Navy was a suitable place to hide a son who wasn't bright enough for university or martial enough for the cavalry. But they did not send him to a cushioned officers' school. In a rare moment of agreement between his liberal father and his conservative grandfather, Kaiser Wilhelm I, it was decided that if Heinrich was to be a sailor, he would be a real sailor. There would be no special treatment. In 1878, at the age of 16, Prince Heinrich embarked on a 2-year voyage around the world aboard the screw corvette SMS Prince Adalbert. This was not a luxury liner. It was a warship of the transition era. It had steam engines, but it relied mostly on sail to save coal. It was cramped, damp, and smelled of grease, unwashed bodies, and salt pork. For a boy raised in the silk-lined palaces of Potsdam, the shock must have been absolute. He was designated as a simple midshipman. His orders were strict. He was to perform all the duties of his rank. He scrubbed the decks with holy stones. He climbed the rigging in gale-force winds to furl the heavy canvas sails, his hands bleeding and freezing. He shoveled coal into the furnaces in the blistering heat of the tropics, choking on the black dust. He ate weevil-infested biscuits and drank stale water. During this voyage, the Prince of Prussia disappeared, and sailor Heinrich was born. This voyage was the making of the man. While Wilhelm was in Bonn attending university, drinking beer with aristocrats, and growing a mustache to look fierce, Heinrich was seeing the world. He saw the vastness of the Atlantic, the exoticism of South America, and the ancient cultures of Asia. He visited Japan in the midst of the Meiji Restoration, witnessing a nation rapidly modernizing, trading samurais for industrialists. He saw the power of the British Empire not as an abstract concept on a map, but as a physical reality in ports from Gibraltar to Hong Kong. He saw the Royal Navy's ships in every harbor, massive, efficient, and ubiquitous. It was during these long night watches under the Southern Cross that Heinrich developed a worldview that was fundamentally different from the one festering in Berlin. He understood the scale of the world. He understood that Germany, for all its army's might, was a landlocked power with limited reach. He saw that the world was interconnected by trade and that disrupting that trade meant ruin. He learned humility, not the false modesty of a courtier, but the genuine humility of a man who knows that a rogue wave can swallow a prince just as easily as a pauper. The crew of the Prince Adalbert came to adore him. Sailors have a keen nose for fraud, and they knew that Heinrich was the real thing. He didn't complain. He shared their hardships. He was interested in their lives. He had a natural, easy way with the common men that Wilhelm never achieved. Wilhelm would speechify to soldiers. Heinrich would talk with sailors. There is a story from this time of Heinrich in a port in Brazil, covered in coal dust, being mistaken for a stoker by a local merchant. Instead of being offended, Heinrich laughed and bought the man a drink. It was inconceivable that his brother would ever react with such grace. When he returned to Germany in 1880, he was changed. He was 18, tanned, muscular, and exuding a quiet confidence. He had crossed the equator, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and navigated the treacherous waters of Cape Horn. He was a man of the world, but he returned to a family that was disintegrating. The conflict between his parents and the aging Kaiser Wilhelm I and Chancellor Bismarck had reached a boiling point. His brother Wilhelm had now fully sided with the conservatives, treating his own parents with contempt. The family dinners were excruciating affairs, filled with icy silences and veiled insults. Heinrich, fresh from the camaraderie of the ship's mess, found the atmosphere in Berlin toxic. He tried to remain neutral, a buffer between the warring factions, but his natural sympathies lay with his parents' desire for a more rational, less aggressive Germany. However, he was a soldier, or rather a sailor, and obedience was ingrained in him. He loved his brother despite everything. He looked up to Wilhelm as the future emperor. Heinrich's tragedy was his loyalty. He was loyal to a brother who would ultimately betray everything Heinrich stood for. In the early 1880s, Heinrich continued his naval education at the Naval Academy in Kiel. This was a period of intense intellectual growth for him. He wasn't studying philosophy or law. He was studying ballistics, navigation, steam engineering, and naval tactics. He became a technical expert. He understood the capabilities of torpedoes, the range of artillery, the tensile strength of armor plating. This technical grounding gave him a perspective that the civilian leadership in Berlin lacked. When they talked of naval prestige, Heinrich thought of fuel consumption and turning radiuses. It was also during this time that he deepened his relationship with his British relatives. He was a frequent visitor to England, staying with his grandmother, Queen Victoria, at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight or Windsor Castle. He felt at home in England. The informality of the British aristocracy, their love of country life and the sea, appealed to his nature far more than the stiff corset-wearing formality of the Prussian court. He spoke English without an accent. He read the Times. He adopted British tailoring. Most importantly, he bonded with his cousins, particularly Prince George, the Duke of York, who would later become King George V. The two men were strikingly similar. They were both second sons. George only became heir after his older brother Eddie died. They were both naval officers by training and inclination. They both possessed the same bearded, heavy-lidded, slightly melancholic look. In photographs from this era, it is sometimes difficult to tell them apart. They formed a friendship based on shared professional interests and a shared temperament. They wrote to each other about ships and gunnery trials. This Anglophilia was another point of contention with Wilhelm. Wilhelm's relationship with England was a pathological mix of love and hate. He desperately wanted to be accepted by the British, to be admired as an English gentleman, yet he felt constantly slighted and patronized by them. He saw the Royal Navy as a personal insult. When Heinrich praised the British Navy's efficiency, Wilhelm heard it as a criticism of Germany. Wilhelm wanted to build a fleet to scare the British into respecting him. Heinrich wanted a fleet that could actually fight if necessary, but he preferred cooperation. He saw the British Navy not as a rival to be destroyed, but as a model to be emulated and a partner to be courted. In 1884, Germany began its late and frantic scramble for colonies. Bismarck, who had famously said, "My map of Africa lies in Europe," was reluctantly dragged into the imperial game by public pressure and the desires of the younger generation. Heinrich found himself at the forefront of this new imperialism, but again, his approach was different. While other German colonial adventurers were often brutal and arrogant, causing diplomatic incidents, Heinrich approached his duties with a diplomat's caution. He commanded ships in the squadron sent to secure German interests in Africa and later in Asia. The fateful year of 1888 loomed on the horizon, the year of the three emperors. It would be the year that changed the trajectory of the world and sealed Heinrich's fate as the eternal subordinate. The old Kaiser Wilhelm I, the symbol of the unification, was 90 years old and fading. Heinrich's father, the liberal Hope Fritz, was next in line, but a terrible secret hung over the new palace. Fritz was dying of throat cancer. The doctors were arguing, the court was whispering, and the vultures were circling. Heinrich watched with breaking heart as his strong, handsome father wasted away, unable to speak, breathing through a silver tube in his throat. He saw the agony of his mother, who was fighting a losing battle to ensure her husband survived long enough to enact reforms. And he saw his brother Wilhelm, impatient, cold, practically measuring the throne for his own curtains, treating his dying father as an obstacle and his grieving mother as an enemy. When the old Kaiser died in March 1888, Fritz became Emperor Frederick III. But he was a ghost of an emperor, ruling from his sickbed. He reigned for only 99 days. During those 99 days, Heinrich was constantly at his father's side, a loyal son trying to comfort a man who knew his life's work would be undone the moment he took his last breath. When Frederick III died in June 1888, the liberal dream died with him. Wilhelm II ascended the throne at the age of 29. The era of bravado, of full speed ahead, of disastrous impulsiveness had begun. Heinrich was now the brother of the Kaiser. He was 25 years old. He was a Kapitänsleutnant in the Navy. The dynamic shifted instantly. Wilhelm was no longer just the older brother. He was the all-highest, the warlord. Heinrich had to bow to him. He had to kiss his hand. And Wilhelm, insecure in his new power, demanded absolute submission. He needed Heinrich to be the loyal follower to validate his own authority He needed Heinrich to be the Prussian prince who supported the throne, not the English liberal who questioned it. And so Heinrich made his choice. He would serve. He would suppress his doubts. He would bury his own political instincts. He would be the perfect soldier. Wilhelm was already planning the expansion of the navy, dreaming of battleships that would rival Britain's. He looked to his brother, the sailor, and said, "Now, we will build." Heinrich nodded, but his eyes, trained on the vast, unforgiving horizons of the Atlantic, held a flicker of deep, unspoken concern. He knew, as Wilhelm did not, that the ocean was a graveyard for the arrogant. With the ascension of Wilhelm II in 1888, the course of the German Empire was set toward collision. But for Heinrich, the challenge was not merely navigating his brother's erratic ego or the high politics of Berlin. As the 1890s dawned, the sailor prince found that his greatest battles would not be fought on the high seas, but within the walls of his own home. Behind the gold braid and the stiff collar of his uniform, he was building a private world defined by a quiet, heartbreaking struggle that would test his stoicism far more than any storm at sea. On May 24, 1888, just months before his father's tragic death, Heinrich married his first cousin, Princess Irene of Hesse and by Rhine. To the public, it was a glittering match between two grandchildren of Queen Victoria. The streets of Berlin were hung with garlands, and the press celebrated the union of the sailor prince and his demure bride. But the marriage carried a shadow that no amount of bunting could conceal. Irene was the sister of Alexandra, the future Tsarina of Russia, and both women were carriers of the genetic curse of the House of Coburg, hemophilia. The royal disease was a specter that haunted the European dynasties, a terrifying biological roulette. For a man like Heinrich, whose entire professional ethos was built on control, discipline, and physical robustness, the intrusion of this uncontrollable, chaotic ailment into his home was a profound psychological blow. They settled at the Himmelmark estate in Schleswig-Holstein, a rugged, wind-battered manor far removed from the suffocating intrigues of Potsdam. Here, Heinrich sought normalcy. He wanted to be a country gentleman, a father, and a husband. He loved Irene deeply. Their letters reveal a tenderness that was utterly absent in Wilhelm's relationships. But the curse struck. Their first son, Waldemar, born in 1889, was a hemophiliac. Their third son, Heinrich, born in 1900, also carried the defect. Only the middle son, Sigismund, was spared. The diagnosis turned their home into a fortress of anxiety. Every sharp corner, every rug, every playful tumble could result in internal bleeding that would not stop. The prince, who commanded battleships and stared down typhoons, found himself helpless in the face of a bruised knee. This domestic tragedy is crucial to understanding Heinrich's character in the 1890s. While Wilhelm was in Berlin shouting about shining armor and the glory of the sword, Heinrich was at home, watching his children with a heart clenched in fear, knowing how fragile human life actually was. It stripped him of any romantic illusions about pain or death. War, for Wilhelm, was an abstract concept of glory. For Heinrich, the sight of blood was a daily terrifying reality. In 1904, the nightmare materialized. The 4-year-old Prince Heinrich, the namesake of his father, fell from a table. It was a minor accident, the kind that happens in nurseries every day. But for the boy, it was fatal. The bleeding in his brain could not be stemmed. Heinrich watched his son die in agony. The grief was shattering. Yet, true to his code, the elder Heinrich did not wail or rage. He retreated into a silence so deep it was like a wall. He buried his son, straightened his uniform, and returned to duty. But those who knew him said the light in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by a permanent, melancholic vigilance. He had looked into the abyss, and he determined that his duty was to prevent any further unnecessary loss of life, a conviction that would put him on a collision course with the reckless policies of his brother. Professionally, the 1890s saw Heinrich rise rapidly through the ranks of the Imperial Navy. But he was not a parade admiral. He was becoming the foremost technical expert in the fleet. While the Kaiser was obsessed with the size of ships, the sheer tonnage and the caliber of the guns, Heinrich was obsessed with the systems. He recognized early on that the future of naval warfare lay not just in brute force, but in technology. He became a champion of the torpedo. In the late 19th century, the torpedo was a revolutionary, somewhat disreputable weapon. It was the weapon of the weak against the strong, a way for a small boat to sink a battleship. Traditionalists hated it. Wilhelm found it unglamorous, but Heinrich saw its potential. He commanded torpedo boat flotillas, drilling his men in high-speed maneuvers, working out the mathematics of intercept courses. He loved the grease, the steam, and the precision of the machinery. He was a prince of the machine age. This practical mindset extended beyond the Navy. Heinrich was Germany's first royal motorist. At a time when cars were seen as noisy, smelly toys for eccentrics, Heinrich saw the future of transport. He didn't just drive them, he fixed them. He could strip an engine and put it back together. It was during one of his rainy drives through the countryside that he grew frustrated with the inability to see through the windshield. He went to his workshop and designed a mechanical wiper blade for his car. In 1908, he received the first German patent for such a device, independently of American inventors. It is a perfect metaphor for the two brothers. Wilhelm created storms, Heinrich invented the wiper to see through them. However, the political storm was gathering, and Heinrich could not simply wipe it away. The defining moment of German imperial hubris, and Heinrich's complicated role in it, came in 1897 with the seizure of Jiaozhou, in China. Germany, late to the colonial game, was desperate for a naval base in East Asia to rival British Hong Kong. When two German missionaries were murdered in China, Wilhelm seized the pretext to send a squadron to occupy the Bay of Jiaozhou. He appointed his brother, Prince Heinrich, to lead the reinforcements. It was a mission of imperial aggression, pure and simple. The departure ceremony in Kiel in December 1897 became infamous. It was a cold winter day. The troops were assembled. Kaiser Wilhelm II, wearing his admiral's uniform, mounted the podium and delivered a speech that would ring down through history, not for its wisdom, but for its dangerous bombast. He shouted to his brother and the departing sailors, "Should anyone attempt to affront us or to prejudice us in our good rights, then strike out with your mailed fist. If you find it necessary, you will also secure respect for the German flag and the German name." The mailed fist speech was a diplomatic disaster. It painted Germany as a brutal, aggressive bully. The international press, particularly in Britain, was appalled. Standing there, listening to his brother scream about mailed fists and laurels for the brow, Heinrich must have felt a familiar sinking sensation. He knew he was being sent on a delicate diplomatic mission, and his brother was sending him off with a declaration of war against the world. Heinrich's response at that banquet is often overlooked, but it is revealing. When he rose to speak, he did not echo Wilhelm's bloodlust. Instead, he spoke of duty. He looked at his brother and said, with a strange, almost religious intensity, "I go purely as a humble servant. My only desire is to proclaim the gospel of your Majesty's hallowed person abroad to those who will hear it, and also to those who will not." Critics mocked this as sycophancy. They called it the gospel of His Majesty's person. But looked at closer, it reads as a desperate attempt by Heinrich to reframe the mission. He was trying to say, I am not going as a conqueror on my own behalf. I am going as a representative of the state bound by duty. He was trying to neutralize the mailed fist with the shield of loyalty. When Heinrich arrived in East Asia, his conduct was surprisingly different from the Kaiser's rhetoric. He did not go rampaging through China striking people with a mailed fist. Instead, he became the first European potentate to be received by the Emperor of China and the formidable Empress Dowager Cixi in the Forbidden City. The court in Beijing was terrified of the foreign devils. They expected a barbarian warlord. Instead, they got Prince Heinrich, polite, curious, respectful of protocol, and deeply interested in Chinese culture. He bowed properly. He spoke softly. He charmed the Empress Dowager, who was known to be implacably hostile to foreigners. One observer noted that Heinrich did more for German prestige in a week of bowing than the Kaiser did in a decade of shouting. He spent 2 years in East Asia, managing the new colony of Qingtao. Under his watch and later under the administration he helped set up, Qingtao became a model colony, efficient, clean, with a university and a brewery that still exists today. He proved that Germany could be a constructive power, not just a disruptive one. But back in Berlin, the lesson was lost. Wilhelm didn't care about the efficient administration. He only cared that Germany now had a place in the sun. Upon his return to Germany in 1900, the world had changed again. The relationship with Britain, the cornerstone of European peace and the bedrock of Heinrich's personal identity, was beginning to crack. The cause was one man, Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz. Tirpitz was a visionary but a dangerous one. He had the Kaiser's ear. He proposed the risk theory. The idea was to build a German battle fleet so large that while it might not be able to defeat the Royal Navy, it would be strong enough to inflict such heavy damage that the British would never dare to attack. It was a strategy based on blackmail. To work, it required Germany to build battleships at a feverish pace. Heinrich was now a vice admiral, a man of immense influence within the service, and he was deeply, profoundly skeptical of Tirpitz's plan. Heinrich knew the Royal Navy. He knew his cousin George. He knew the British temperament better than any man in the German government. He realized a fundamental truth that Tirpitz ignored. The British would not be blackmailed. If Germany built one ship, Britain would build 2. If Germany built 2, Britain would build 4. In the quiet corridors of the Naval Ministry and in private conversations with his brother, Heinrich tried to inject reality into the fever dream. He argued for a cruiser war strategy, fast ships that could protect trade and patrol the colonies, rather than a heavy battle fleet concentrated in the North Sea, pointing a gun at London. He warned that the high seas fleet was a strategic dead end. It would consume the German economy, antagonize the only ally that mattered, and in the end, it would likely stay trapped in port, too expensive to risk. But Wilhelm was intoxicated by Tirpitz. He loved the models of the new dreadnoughts. He loved the idea of being the admiral of the Atlantic. He began to view Heinrich's caution as a lack of nerve. Heinrich is too English, the whispers went around the court. He doesn't have the stomach for the great game. Heinrich was sidelined from the decision-making process. He was given prestigious commands. He led the ice squadron, then the high seas fleet itself for a time, but he was cut out of the grand strategy. He was the driver of the car, but he wasn't allowed to look at the map. As the first decade of the 20th century wore on, the tragedy accelerated. The Anglo-German naval arms race began in earnest. Every rivet driven into a German hull was a nail in the coffin of peace. Heinrich continued to visit England, desperately trying to use his personal popularity to smooth things over. He was a regular at the Cowes Regatta, sailing his yacht Meteor. The British crowds cheered him. They liked this quiet, bearded German prince who sailed well and lost gracefully. They called him a decent chap, but personal charm could not stop the geopolitical rot. In 1901, Queen Victoria died. She had been the matriarch of Europe, the grandmother who could bang the heads of the unruly cousins together. With her death, the restraints were off. Wilhelm's jealousy of his uncle, King Edward VII, became poisonous. There is a poignant moment from this era that captures Heinrich's position perfectly. During a visit to Kiel by King Edward VII, Wilhelm was putting on a massive display of naval power, parading his new battleships. He was puffing his chest, pointing out the guns, practically daring his uncle to be impressed. Heinrich stood a few paces behind them. He caught the eye of a British admiral he knew well. He didn't say a word. He just gave a slight, almost imperceptible shrug. It was a gesture of apology, of shared embarrassment, and of helplessness. "I know," the shrug said. "I know this is madness, but he is the emperor." By 1910, the die was cast. The fleets were built. The alliances were solidified. Germany was encircled exactly as Heinrich had feared. The risk theory had failed. Instead of scaring Britain into friendship, it had driven Britain into the arms of France and Russia. Heinrich, now a Grand Admiral, was promoted to the rank of Inspector General of the Navy. It sounded grand, but it was effectively a way to kick him upstairs. It removed him from operational command of the High Seas Fleet, placing a buffer between the pessimistic prince and the aggressive captains who were itching for war. But Heinrich had one more passion, one more area where he sought to modernize Germany, and it would lead him to the skies. Just as he had embraced the car and the torpedo, Heinrich embraced the airplane. In 1910, at the age of 48, an age when most royals were content to sit in armchairs, Prince Heinrich learned to fly. He earned German pilot's license number 38. He didn't just fly for fun. He saw the military potential of aviation immediately. He pushed for the creation of a naval air arm. There is something deeply symbolic about this. While the rest of the German leadership was obsessed with heavy steel, trenches, and fortifications, looking down into the mud, Heinrich was looking up. He was trying to find a new dimension, a way to break the stalemate he knew was coming. But as with everything else, his vision was appreciated only as a novelty, not as a strategy. Despite his technical mastery and his desperate attempts to modernize the fleet's strategy, Heinrich was ultimately a man shouting into a hurricane. The naval arms race he had feared had come to pass, alienating Britain and encircling Germany just as he had predicted. Now, as the calendar turned to the fateful summer of 1914, the time for theoretical arguments was over. The fuse was lit in Sarajevo, and Prince Heinrich was about to find himself trapped in a diplomatic tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, one where a single conversation with a beloved cousin would haunt him for the rest of his life. July 1914 was the most beautiful summer in living memory. The sun beat down on the golden wheat fields of Prussia and sparkled on the blue waters of the Solent in England. Europe was a continent basking in its own zenith, wealthy, interconnected, and seemingly secure. In Kiel, the great warships of the German High Seas Fleet swung lazily at their anchors, their crews painting hulls and scrubbing decks, expecting nothing more dangerous than a training cruise to Norway. But inside the palaces of Berlin, St. Petersburg, and Vienna, the machinery of doomsday had already begun to grind. Following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, The diplomatic cables were humming with ultimatums. Yet amidst this sliding catastrophe, Prince Heinrich of Prussia found himself at the epicenter of a frantic personal attempt to stop the clock. It was here, in the final days of peace, that Heinrich's tragic duality, the English gentleman and the Prussian officer, would collide with devastating consequences. On Sunday, July 26, 1914, just days before the world erupted, Prince Heinrich was not in a war room. He was in his car, rushing to the station to catch a train back to Germany. He had been in England, visiting his sister and his cousins. He had seen the British fleet. He had spoken with the First Sea Lord, Prince Louis of Battenberg, another German relative at the heart of the British establishment. Before leaving, Heinrich had a brief, urgent conversation with his cousin, King George V. The details of this conversation have been debated by historians for a century, but they constitute one of the most heartbreaking misunderstandings of the era. Heinrich, desperate for reassurance, asked George what England would do if Austria and Russia went to war. George V, a constitutional monarch with no power to declare war or make binding promises, replied with typical British understatement, "I hope we shall remain neutral, or perhaps we shall try to keep out of it." To a British ear, this was a polite expression of hope, a non-committal pleasantry. But Heinrich heard what he wanted to hear. He heard what he needed to hear. He interpreted the king's polite evasion as a solemn royal pledge. Heinrich arrived in Berlin on July 28th. He went straight to the Neue Palais to see his brother. He found Wilhelm in a state of manic anxiety, oscillating between bellicose shouting and terrified trembling. Wilhelm was terrified of a two-front war against France and Russia, but he was absolutely petrified of Britain joining in. If the Royal Navy entered the war, Germany would be strangled. Heinrich, breathless and dusty from travel, delivered his news. "I have the word of Georgie. England will stay neutral." For a few hours, this false hope intoxicated the Kaiser. Wilhelm grasped at it like a drowning man. "I have the word of a king," he exclaimed to his skeptical generals. He believed that the old aristocratic code still ruled the world, that a cousin's whisper in a garden could override treaties and parliaments. Heinrich, the realist, had inadvertently fed his brother's delusion. He had given Wilhelm the one thing he shouldn't have had, a reason to believe he could gamble and win. But the illusion shattered within 48 hours. As German troops prepared to violate Belgian neutrality, the Red Line, for Britain, the British government made its position clear. They would fight. When the telegram arrived from London, confirming that Britain would stand by its treaties and defend Belgium, the Kaiser was apoplectic. He felt personally betrayed by his deceitful cousin. He raged against perfidious Albion. But for Heinrich, the blow was far deeper. It wasn't just political, it was a personal humiliation. He had misread his second home, he had misled his brother. And now the two navies he loved, the German and the British, were going to destroy each other. On August 4th, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. The Great War had begun. In the chaotic days of mobilization, while millions of men marched toward the French border, the German Navy was paralyzed by indecision. The Kaiser, suddenly terrified of risking his precious battleships, ordered the high seas fleet to stay in port. The great dreadnoughts, the ones that had cost billions of marks and antagonized the world, were to be preserved. But Prince Heinrich was not a man to sit in a harbor. He requested an active command. On August 14, 1914, his 52nd birthday, he was appointed commander-in-chief of the Baltic forces. To the arrogant strategists in Berlin, the Baltic was a backwater. The real war was in the North Sea against England. The Baltic was a secondary theater, a lake where nothing important would happen. They gave Heinrich a collection of scrap metal to fight with. While the shiny modern dreadnoughts sat idle in Wilhelmshaven, Heinrich was given the Wittelsbach-class pre-dreadnoughts, slow, obsolete ships with outdated guns and thin armor. He was given a handful of light cruisers and some torpedo boats. His mission, however, was critical. He had to protect the German coast from Russian invasion. He had to keep the sea lanes to Sweden open, as Germany desperately needed Swedish iron ore to keep its war industry running. And he had to bottle up the Russian Baltic fleet, which on paper was formidable. This was a task that required not the bluster of the Kaiser, but the cold, calculating professionalism of the engineer. And this was where Heinrich shone. He moved his headquarters to Kiel and immediately changed the atmosphere. There were no grand speeches about glory. There was only work. He realized immediately that he could not fight a traditional naval battle. His ships were too old, and the Russians were modernizing rapidly with their new Gangut-class dreadnoughts. If he tried to fight a line of battle engagement, he would be blown out of the water. So Heinrich invented a new kind of war. He invented the guerrilla war at sea. He transformed the Baltic into a nightmare of mines and submarines. He realized that the Russians were timid. They were still traumatized by their defeat by Japan in 1905. He played on that fear. He ordered aggressive mine-laying operations right off the mouth of the Gulf of Finland, trapping the Russian fleet in its ports. He used his light forces to strike quickly and then retreat, keeping the enemy constantly off balance. The irony was palpable. The modern high seas fleet in the North Sea was fighting a 19th century war of positioning that resulted in nothing, while in the forgotten Baltic, Prince Heinrich was fighting a truly 20th century war of stealth technology and psychology. But the war in the Baltic was personal in a way the war in France was not. Heinrich was fighting against the navy of Tsar Nicholas II. The Tsar was not just an enemy monarch. He was Niki, the husband of Heinrich's sister-in-law, Alexandra. Every shell Heinrich fired was aimed at his wife's family. Heinrich wrote letters to Irene during these months that reveal a man torn apart. He described the awful duty of war. He worried constantly about her distress. Irene, back at Himmelmark, was living a nightmare, with her husband fighting her sister's husband and her sons clamoring to join the army. Then, in August 1914, just weeks into the war, a singular event occurred under Heinrich's command that would change the course of history, though he would not know it for years. On a foggy night, the German light cruiser SMS Magdeburg, part of Heinrich's force, ran aground off the island of Odensholm in the Gulf of Finland. The ship was stranded. The Russian Navy closed in. The German captain, realizing the ship was lost, ordered the secret codebooks to be burned. But in the panic and chaos, one set of codebooks, the key to the entire German naval communication system, was not destroyed. It was thrown overboard. Russian divers recovered the codebook from the seabed. They realized what they had found. In an act of supreme alliance, the Russians sent the codebook to London, to the British Admiralty's cryptic section, Room 40. Because of this accident in Heinrich's theater, the British were able to read German naval codes for the rest of the war. Every time the Kaiser ordered his fleet to move, the British knew they were coming. Heinrich, the prudent commander, had suffered a catastrophic intelligence failure that was sheer bad luck, a twist of fate that would doom the German Navy. He spent the war wondering why the British always seemed to be one step ahead, never knowing that the answer lay in the wreck of one of his own cruisers. Despite this, Heinrich's leadership in 1914 and 1915 was masterful. In 1915, the German army began a major offensive into the Baltic states, capturing Libau and Riga. Heinrich's job was to support the army's flank from the sea. He did this with a terrifying efficiency. He coordinated combined operations, Army and Navy working together, which was a revolutionary concept at the time. He used seaplanes for reconnaissance, personally debriefing the pilots. He even took flights himself to see the ice conditions, much to the horror of his staff who, terrified of losing the Kaiser's brother in a flimsy biplane. There is a photograph from this period that captures the essence of Heinrich's war. He is standing on the bridge of his flagship, wearing a heavy leather coat and binoculars. His beard is gray, his face is gaunt, and his eyes are narrowed against the biting wind. He does not look like a prince. He looks like a tired, hardened sea captain. Behind him, the gray waves of the Baltic roll endlessly. There is no pomp here, just the cold, hard business of holding the line. While Wilhelm was moving little flags on a map in a warm chateau in Spa, fantasizing about capturing Paris, Heinrich was dealing with frozen torpedo tubes and mutinous stokers. He was dealing with the reality that the war was not going to be short, and it was not going to be glorious. By 1916, the stalemate had set in. The blockade was tightening. The German people were beginning to starve. The turnip winter was approaching. And in the Navy, morale was beginning to crack. The sailors in the big ships in the North Sea were bored, sitting in port for years, eating bad food and being yelled at by aristocratic officers who had never seen combat. But in the Baltic, morale held. Why? Because Heinrich's men were fighting, they were active, and because they respected their commander. Heinrich was known to inspect the galleys personally. He ensured his men were fed as well as possible. He spoke to them, not at them. He was the people's prince. In a way, Wilhelm never could be. However, the rot in the empire was spreading. The loss of life on the Western Front was staggering. Verdun, the Somme, the lists of the dead in the newspapers grew longer every day. Heinrich read the names. He saw the sons of his friends, the sons of his tenants, and he saw the futility of it all. He began to write private memorandums to the Kaiser, urging him to seek a negotiated peace. "We cannot win a total victory," he wrote. "We must find a way out before the monarchy itself is destroyed." But Wilhelm was now surrounded by the silent dictatorship of generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff. These two men had effectively sidelined the Kaiser, turning him into a figurehead. They believed in victory or ruin. They had no time for a pessimistic admiral who talked about compromise. Heinrich's letters were filed away, unread or ignored. The tragedy of Prince Heinrich was entering its final, darkest phase. He was a man shouting fire in a crowded theater where the doors were locked and the management was turning up the volume of the orchestra. He had secured the Baltic. He had protected the coast. He had done his duty. But he could not protect Germany from its own leaders. The red flag rising over the Russian fleet was a harbinger of the chaos to come. But before the German Empire would fully collapse, it would have to endure the deepest circle of hell. As the war dragged into 1917, the initial patriotic fervor had frozen into a grim struggle for survival. For Heinrich, the coming winter would bring not only physical hunger to his people, but a strategic gambit that would test his brilliance as a commander and break his heart as a husband. The gentleman's war was over. The era of total desperation had begun. The winter of 1917 was not merely a season, it was a condition of existence. It was the turnip winter, a time when the British blockade had tightened its steel noose around Germany's throat so effectively that the proud empire of the Hohenzollerns was reduced to eating cattle fodder. In the great cities of Berlin and Hamburg, civilians were boiling turnips in water, their skin turning gray from malnutrition. But on the shores of the Baltic, Prince Heinrich faced a chill that went deeper than hunger. He was watching the systematic dismantling of the world. he had been born to uphold. For Heinrich and his wife, Princess Irene, the war had ceased to be a geopolitical struggle and had become a slow-motion horror story involving their own flesh and blood. Across the frozen battle lines, in the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, Irene's sister, the Tsarina Alexandra, and her husband, Tsar Nicholas II, were no longer rulers. Following the February Revolution of 1917, they were prisoners. Heinrich was in an agonizing position. As the commander-in-chief of the Baltic forces, his duty was to crush the Russian military. Every mine he laid, every coastal bombardment he ordered, contributed to the chaos that was endangering his in-laws. At Himmelmark, Irene lived by the mailbox waiting for letters that increasingly failed to arrive. The sisters had always been close, united by their shared British upbringing and the tragic gene of hemophilia that they had both passed to their sons. Now, a wall of silence had descended between them. Heinrich, usually so reserved, tried to pull strings. He used his connections in neutral Sweden and Denmark to try and get news to see if there was any way to negotiate a safe passage for the Romanov family. But the new provisional government in Russia was unstable, and the rising Bolshevik tide viewed the Tsar not as a relative to be pitied, but as a symbol to be destroyed. Heinrich realized with a sinking heart that the dynastic solidarity that had preserved European monarchs for centuries, the trade union of kings, was bankrupt. Being a cousin of the King of England or the Kaiser of Germany no longer offered protection. In the new century, it just painted a target on your back. Yet, amidst this personal turmoil, Heinrich achieved his greatest professional triumph, a victory that is barely mentioned in general history books, but remains a masterpiece of naval warfare. It was Operation Albion. In October 1917, the German High Command decided to seize the West Estonian archipelago, the islands of Ussel, Moon, and Dago, to secure the Gulf of Riga and threaten the Russian capital, Petrograd. It was a massive amphibious assault, the largest Germany would ever attempt in the First World War, and Prince Heinrich was the architect. While the British landing at Gallipoli in 1915 had been a bloody disaster marked by incompetence and confusion, Heinrich's Operation Albion was a clockwork marvel of combined arms. He assembled a massive task force, 350 ships, 25,000 soldiers, horses, vehicles, and aircraft. He brought in heavy battleships from the High Seas Fleet to provide gunfire support. What makes this operation fascinating is how modern it looks. Heinrich coordinated the landing craft with creeping artillery barrages. He used seaplanes for real-time reconnaissance, directing the fire of the battleships SMS Bayern and SMS Grosser Kurfürst onto Russian batteries hidden in the forests. He integrated mine-sweeping operations with troop movements seamlessly. Heinrich commanded from the rear, but his stamp was on every detail. He insisted on thorough planning to minimize casualties. He overruled the army generals who wanted to rush blindly onto the beaches. "We will land," he told them, "when the guns are silenced, not before." The operation was a spectacular success. The islands were captured in weeks. The Russian naval forces were routed or sunk. Thousands of prisoners were taken with minimal German losses. It proved definitively that the German Navy was not just a parade ground force. Under a competent leader like Heinrich, it was a lethal, sophisticated weapon. But the victory was hollow. Heinrich stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the gray Russian coastline, knowing that this tactical brilliance changed nothing strategically. Germany was winning battles on the map, but losing the war of resources. And a new, darker shadow was rising from the very victory he had just won. The success of Operation Albion and the collapse of Russia allowed the German High Command to shift nearly 1 million soldiers to the Western Front for one final desperate gamble, the Spring Offensive of 1918. To support this, they needed to cut the supply lines of Britain. They turned to the one weapon Heinrich had viewed with deep suspicion, the U-boat. The decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917 had been the turning point. Heinrich had argued against it in private. He knew the mathematics of the sea. He knew that sinking American merchant ships would inevitably drag the United States into the war. You cannot fight the whole world, he had warned. The Atlantic is a bridge for America, and we cannot cut it with submarines alone. But the Kaiser, listening to the fanatical Admiral von Holzendorf, believed the promise that not one American soldier will land on the continent. It was a delusion of staggering proportions. By early 1918, Heinrich's prophecy was coming true. The U-boats were sinking millions of tons of shipping, but they weren't starving Britain into submission. Instead, the doughboys were arriving in France by the hundreds of thousands. The industrial might of the United States was tipping the scales. Heinrich saw this from his post in Kiel. He saw the new American destroyers appearing in the North Sea. He saw the morale of his own sailors beginning to fray. The blockade was starving their families. The letters from home were full of misery, stories of bread riots, of children dying of tuberculosis, of a society breaking down. And then in July 1918, the personal nightmare reached its crescendo. Rumors began to circulate that the Tsar and his family had been moved to a house in Yekaterinburg, deep in the Urals. Then came the confused, horrifying reports. The Bolsheviks had executed the Tsar. Initially, they claimed the family was safe, but slowly the awful truth leaked out. They were all dead. Nicholas, Alexandra, the 4 beautiful daughters, and the sickly Tsarevich Alexei, all butchered in a cellar. For Irene, the news was a psychological stroke. Her sister Alex was gone. The little boy with hemophilia whom she had worried about just as she worried about her own sons was dead. Heinrich was devastated. He had fought a gentleman's war. He believed in codes of conduct, in the sanctity of non-combatants. The murder of the Romanovs was not war, it was savagery. It signaled to him that the old world, the world of Victorian order and royal decency, was dead. It had been replaced by a world of ideological fanaticism, where even children were political targets. He took a few days of leave at Himmelmark to comfort his shattering wife. Witnesses say he aged 10 years in that week. The spring in his step was gone. He walked the grounds of his estate, staring at the ground, a man carrying the weight of a dying era. When he returned to Kiel, he was no longer fighting for victory. He was fighting for survival. He was fighting to hold the line so that Germany could negotiate a peace that wasn't a total capitulation. But the poison was spreading within his own beloved navy. The German high seas fleet had spent the war largely in port. While Heinrich's Baltic crews were active and disciplined, the crews in Wilhelmshaven and Kiel were idle. Idleness in a military unit is cancer. The sailors lived in cramped steel squalor. They were fed rotten food while they watched their officers eating fresh meat and drinking champagne in the mess halls. The officers, frustrated by their lack of glory, became petty tyrants, enforcing harsh discipline for minor infractions. Socialist agitators began to whisper in the lower decks, "Why are we starving while the Kaiser lives in luxury? Why should we die for a lost cause?" Heinrich saw the signs. He was one of the few admirals who actually walked the docks and talked to the men. He sensed the sullen silence that greets an unpopular officer. He warned Berlin, "The mood is dangerous. The men are hungry, and they have lost faith." Berlin's response was to demand more discipline. They ordered crackdowns. They jailed the ringleaders of a minor mutiny in 1917. They tried to put a lid on a boiling pot. By October 1918, the German army on the Western Front was collapsing. Ludendorff, the dictator of the war effort, suddenly lost his nerve and demanded an immediate armistice. The shock to the German public was total. For 4 years, they had been told they were winning. Now suddenly, they were told it was over. In this vacuum of power and hope, the Naval Command made a decision that was arguably criminal. Admiral Scheer and the naval staff decided to launch Operation Plan 19. It was a suicide mission. The entire High Seas Fleet was to steam out and attack the British Grand Fleet. They knew they would lose. They expected to be annihilated, but they wanted to go down in a death ride to save the honor of the Navy. The order was given: steam up, prepare for battle. The sailors looked at each other. The war was lost. The armistice negotiations were starting, and now their officers wanted to sacrifice 80,000 men in a meaningless gesture of vanity. No. It started as a whisper, then a shout. On the battleships Thuringen and Helgoland, the stokers put out the fires. The sailors refused to weigh anchor. The officers drew their pistols. The mutiny had begun. And where was Heinrich? He was in Kiel, the powder keg. On November 3rd, 1918, the mutinous sailors from the squadron arrived in Kiel. They joined forces with the shipyard workers. They marched through the streets carrying red flags, demanding peace and bread. Heinrich was at the Imperial Yacht Club in Kiel when the shooting started. A patrol fired into a demonstration, killing 7 people. The city exploded. Most aristocratic officers fled or hid. Heinrich did not. He put on his uniform, heavily decorated with the orders of a dying empire, and drove his open car directly into the center of the city. It was an act of insane bravery. He wanted to talk to the sailors. He believed that his personal reputation, his years of being the sailor prince, would count for something. He drove to the barracks where the sailors were arming themselves. He stood up in his car. "Lads," he shouted, "listen to me. Do not destroy your fatherland in this hour of need." For a moment, the crowd hesitated. This was Prince Heinrich, the man who had sailed with them, the man who had inspected their soup, the man who knew how to splice a rope. But then, a young sailor, perhaps a fresh recruit who didn't know the prince, or perhaps a radical who didn't care, shouted, "The Hohenzollerns are the enemy. Tear off his epaulets." A surge of angry men moved toward the car. Someone fired a shot. It struck the tire of Heinrich's car. Another bullet whizzed past his head. Heinrich's driver, a loyal petty officer, slammed the car into reverse. "Your Royal Highness, we must go now." Heinrich looked at the faces of the men. He didn't see the respect he had earned over 40 years of service. He saw hatred. He saw the face of the revolution. As the car sped away, tires screeching, carrying the prince away from the city he had commanded, something broke inside him. The Navy, his life's work, his sanctuary, had rejected him. The connection between the prince and the people, which he had cultivated so carefully, was severed by the sharp blade of hunger and defeat. He returned to the castle in Kiel, but it was no longer safe. The red flag was flying over the battleships in the harbor. The Kaiser's brother was a prize target. The revolutionaries were hunting for tyrants. On November 5th, Heinrich received a telephone call from Berlin. It was Wilhelm. The Kaiser sounded delusional. He was talking about leading the army back to Berlin to crush the rebels. He had no idea of the reality. "Wilhelm," Heinrich said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and finality, "it is over. The Navy is gone. Kiel is in the hands of the Reds. You must abdicate. You must save the dynasty by stepping aside." There was a silence on the line. Then Wilhelm hung up. It was the last time they would speak as emperor and prince. Heinrich realized he had to escape, not for himself but for Irene. If the mob found them, they could be torn to pieces. He was not a coward, but he was not suicidal. He thought of the cellar in Yekaterinburg. He would not let that happen to his wife. The escape of Prince Heinrich is a scene straight out of a thriller. He couldn't use a royal train. He couldn't use a battleship. He had to use the one thing he had always trusted more than horses or politics: the automobile. He went to the garage at the Kiel Castle. He found one of his beloved cars, a sturdy Benz. He stripped the royal insignias off the doors. He found an old hunting jacket and a tweed cap. He didn't look like a Grand Admiral. He looked like an aging chauffeur. He loaded the car with a few cans of gasoline, liquid gold in starving Germany, and a Mauser pistol. He put a red armband on his sleeve, a deceptive camouflage to pass through the checkpoints. He drove out of the castle gates just as a truckload of armed sailors arrived to arrest him. He merged into the chaotic traffic of the city. He drove past the barricades where men with rifles were stopping luxury cars. They saw the red armband, the rough clothes, and the grime on his face, and they waved him through. He drove north, towards Himmelmark. The roads were dangerous. Deserters were roaming the countryside. At one point near Eckernförde, a group of revolutionaries tried to stop the car. Heinrich floored the accelerator. A bullet shattered the rear window. He didn't look back. He reached Himmelmark in the dead of night. The estate was dark. He found Irene waiting in the hallway, terrifyingly calm. They embraced in the shadows of the house that had once been a sanctuary and now felt like a trap. "Is it over?" she asked. "The empire is finished," Heinrich replied, taking off the cap and revealing his gray, exhausted face. "Wilhelm has fled. We are alone." The next morning, November 9th, 1918, the radio announced the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II. The German Republic was proclaimed from a balcony in Berlin. The 500-year rule of the House of Hohenzollern had evaporated in a week. While Wilhelm was settling into a comfortable exile in a Dutch manor house, blaming everyone but himself, Heinrich remained in Germany. He remained in the line of fire. He refused to flee the country. "I am a German," he said. "My place is here." But the Germany he remained in was a place of madness. The stab-in-the-back myth was already being born. The search for scapegoats had begun. And Prince Heinrich, the man who had tried to prevent the war, the man who had fought professionally and honorably, retreated into the deep woods of his estate. He locked the gates. He pulled the curtains. The silence that fell over the Himmelmark estate in the winter of 1918 was not a peaceful silence. It was the terrified hush of a world holding its breath, waiting for the executioner's axe. The German Empire, a colossus that had dominated the center of Europe for nearly half a century, had not just been defeated, it had evaporated. In its place, a chaotic vacuum filled with starving mobs, returning soldiers with hollow eyes, and revolutionaries waving red flags. Inside the manor house, Prince Heinrich and Princess Irene lived like castaways on a fragile island. The man who had commanded battleships and negotiated with emperors now sat in a cold study, wearing a thick wool sweater to ward off the chill, because coal was too precious to burn freely. His Mauser pistol lay on the desk beside his reading glasses. The gates of the estate were locked. The few loyal servants who remained were armed with hunting rifles, patrolling the perimeter against the bands of looters roaming the Schleswig-Holstein countryside. This was the 0 hour, Stunde Null. For Heinrich, the psychological dislocation was absolute. He had spent 40 years in a uniform that defined his existence. That uniform was now a death sentence, a symbol of the guilty men who had led Germany to ruin. He had stripped the epaulets from his coat, but he could not strip the history from his soul. He was a Hohenzollern. The name itself was now a curse on the streets of Berlin and Kiel. while his brother, the former Kaiser Wilhelm II, was settling into a surreal, comfortable exile at Warmonger Castle in the Netherlands. Complaining about the tea and blaming the Jewish conspiracy for his downfall, Heinrich remained in the line of fire. He refused to leave German soil. This decision was not born of optimism, but of a grim, stubborn sense of honor. If the ship goes down, he told Irene, the officers do not take the first lifeboat. But the ship was not just sinking, it was being torn apart by vultures. In the early months of 1919, the victors gathered in Paris to decide Germany's fate. The Treaty of Versailles was being hammered out. Heinrich followed the news with a growing sense of horror. He had expected harsh terms, he was a realist after all, but he had not expected the calculated humiliation that was emerging. The stripping of territory, the confiscation of the merchant marine, the massive reparations that would enslave the German economy for generations. And then came the blow that struck him personally, straight to the heart, the surrender of the High Seas Fleet. The terms of the armistice had demanded that the pride of the German Navy, 74 of its most modern ships, be interned at the British naval base of Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands. Heinrich had watched from afar as the ships sailed out of Wilhelmshaven for the last time in November 1918. They did not sail to battle. They sailed to captivity. It was a funeral procession of steel. For 7 months, the German crews languished in the cold gray harbor of Scapa Flow. They were prisoners on their own ships, demoralized, mutinous, and bored. Heinrich thought of them constantly. These were his ships. These were the machines he had helped to build, the crews he had trained. Then came June 21st, 1919. The deadline for the signing of the Treaty of Versailles was approaching. The German commander at Scapa Flow, Rear Admiral Ludwig von Reuter, believed that the British were about to seize the ships. He decided that the German Navy would not suffer the ultimate disgrace of having its ships fly the Union Jack. He issued the code signal. Paragraph 11, confirm. It was the order to scuttle. At Himmelmark, the news arrived via a crackling telephone line. In Scapa Flow, the seacocks had been opened. One by one, the great dreadnoughts, the Bayern, the Kronprinz Wilhelm, the Markgraf, began to list and capsize. The British guards watched in stunned disbelief as the German fleet committed suicide. The water boiled as the massive turrets slipped beneath the waves. The German sailors took to the lifeboats, cheering as their ships went down with their ensigns flying. When Heinrich heard the news, he did not weep. He went to the window and looked out at the Baltic Sea. For the first time in years, a look of grim satisfaction crossed his face. The death ride that the admirals had wanted in 1918 had finally happened, but not in battle. It was an act of defiance. The High Seas Fleet was not surrendered. It had died by its own hand. They have saved their honor, Heinrich whispered. It was a cold comfort, a Roman ending to a Greek tragedy. But for a man raised in the code of Prussian honor, it was everything. The fleet was gone, but it was not British. However, the Allies were furious. The scuttling of the fleet hardened their resolve. The war guilt clause of the Treaty of Versailles, Article 231, declared Germany solely responsible for the war. And with it came the demand for war criminals to be handed over for trial. The list of names produced by the Allies was a shock. It included Hindenburg, Ludendorff, Tirpitz, and Kaiser Wilhelm II. The British Prime Minister David Lloyd George had won an election on the slogan, "Hang the Kaiser." This terrifying prospect jolted Heinrich out of his seclusion. The idea of his brother, the anointed emperor, the head of the House of Hohenzollern, being dragged before a foreign court like a common murderer was intolerable. It would be a final, crushing humiliation for the family and the nation. In this moment of crisis, Heinrich performed an act of supreme, selfless nobility that has been almost completely forgotten by history. According to historical anecdotes and family lore, he sat down at his desk at Himmelmark and wrote a letter. It was addressed to his cousin, King George V of England. The relationship between the two cousins had been shattered by the war. They had not spoken since that fateful summer of 1914. Heinrich felt betrayed by George's neutrality comment. George felt betrayed by the German violation of Belgium, but Heinrich swallowed his pride. He wrote not as a prince to a king, but as a man to a man. In the letter, Heinrich did not beg for mercy for himself. He made a stunning offer. He offered to surrender himself to the British authorities in exchange for his brother. If there must be a sacrifice, Heinrich wrote, let it be me. I was the commander-in-chief of the Baltic forces. I held high command. I am the brother of the emperor. Take me, put me on trial. Let the emperor remain in peace. It was the ultimate act of despair. All his life, he had lived in Wilhelm's shadow. Now he was offering to die in it. He was willing to take the blame, to sit in the dock, to perhaps face a firing squad, to save the dignity of the brother who had ignored him, mocked him, and led them all to ruin. The letter was sent via diplomatic channels. It reached London. King George V read it. We can only imagine the emotion the king must have felt, reading the words of his childhood friend, Heinrich of Prussia, offering himself as a sacrificial lamb. The British government, however, did not accept the offer. The political appetite for a trial was fading. The legal complexities were too great, and the Dutch government refused to extradite Wilhelm. But the offer stands as a testament to Heinrich's character. In a world of self-serving generals writing memoirs to cover their tracks, Heinrich was willing to sign his name to a death warrant for a crime he didn't commit. As 1919 turned into 1920, the immediate threat of trials receded, but a new grinding reality set in. The reality of the Weimar Republic. Heinrich was now a private citizen. The titles were legally abolished, though used as surnames. He was Herr Heinrich Prince von Preußen. His naval pension was gone. The family fortune was ravaged by the war bonds they had patriotically bought, and which were now worthless paper, and by the hyperinflation that was beginning to rot the German economy. The transition from Grand Admiral to farmer was abrupt and brutal. The staff at Himmelmark was cut to the bone. The immaculate lawns were dug up to plant potatoes. The ornamental horses were replaced by workhorses. And the prince, now in his late 50s, put on rough tweed and rubber boots and went to work. He did not play at farming like Marie Antoinette playing at being a shepherdess. He farmed because he had to eat. He learned about crop rotation, fertilizers, and milk yields. The locals in Eckernförde would see him driving an old battered car into town to buy supplies, counting his pfennigs carefully at the counter. There was a profound dignity in this. He did not complain. He did not give interviews to foreign journalists for money. He did not write a tell-all book. He simply got on with the business of living. But the political chaos of Germany would not leave him entirely alone. In March 1920, the fragility of the new republic was exposed by the Kapp Putsch. Right-wing paramilitary groups, the Freikorps, marched on Berlin to overthrow the democratic government. They wanted to restore the monarchy. For a few days, the government fled, and the Putschists held the capital. Emissaries came to Himmelmark. They wanted Heinrich's support. They wanted a Hohenzollern figurehead to legitimize their coup. Wilhelm was in Holland and too controversial. Heinrich, the respected soldier, the good Hohenzollern, would be perfect. Heinrich stood on the steps of his manor and turned them away. I am a soldier, he told them. I swore an oath to the emperor. He has released me from that oath. I will not swear an oath to a mob, nor will I break the peace of my country again. He understood what the hot-headed reactionaries did not. The time of kings was over. You could not bomb a monarchy back into existence. Germany needed stability, not another civil war. By refusing to endorse the Kapp Putsch, Heinrich likely saved the region from bloodshed, but he earned the enmity of the extreme right, who began to whisper that he was weak or a Republican. He didn't care. He had seen enough dead bodies. He had no desire to add to the pile. Heinrich lived out his remaining years at Himmelmark, a silent guardian of a lost world. His death from hereditary throat cancer on April 20th, 1929, chillingly, the very day Adolf Hitler turned 40, marked a symbolic passing of the torch from an era of old-world honor to a new age of unspeakable brutality. But the tragedy of his bloodline had one final debt to pay. In 1945, amidst the ruins of the Second World War, his eldest son Waldemar died in agony, simply because the chaotic, broken Germany could no longer provide the medical supplies needed to treat his hemophilia. In the end, Prince Heinrich's legacy is not written in the history books of conquerors, but in the quiet tragedy of the road not taken. He departed this world as the last true captain holding the helm, the visionary who invented the windshield wiper to see clearly through the rain, yet found himself powerless to stop the hurricane of history that swept his world away.